And it's a pleasure to see so many of you coming to hear Professor Pamela McElwee from Rutgers University. She is a professor of human politics. And more importantly, you know, I had the honor of working with her on the Nexus Assessment from IPBES. Pam was the co-chair of the Nexus Assessment, and she is one of the persons that really works on the science policy interface. She has.
The one I see online.
I said to her.
Yes.
She's an incredible person working on the science policy interface. She has had a variety of roles on the IPCC, on IPBES.
There are people online, so they can only see it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. On IPBES and others. And I think that what she's going to do is summarize this incredible report that was accepted in a plenary session in Namibia by all governments. And that it's likely to, you know, to lead the way, to lead the charge on trying to find integrated solutions for protecting biodiversity, climate change, water, human health, and food. So Pam, the floor is yours. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me up. Great. Well, thank you to Professor Herrero for inviting me up and for the kind introduction. I thought what I would do today is start off by asking how many people in the room know what IPBES is? Raise your hand if you know what IPBES is. So a few, yeah, probably not quite half. So I'm not assuming that you know anything about IPBES, and I'll take a little bit of time to explain what this organization is and why it does assessments. And then I'll get into the actual assessment itself that I was part of, that Mario was part of, as part of a large team of expert scientists working on this problem of interconnected crises. So to start off with, IPBES, how many people have heard of IPCC? Okay, more people than IPBES. Great. All right. So you know the general concept, which is we have intergovernmental science policy institutions. So IPCC happens to be for climate. The idea is we need regular assessments of the state of climate science that policymakers can use to adopt in different fora when they're talking about actions to combat climate change. So IPCC is really kind of the grandfather of these type of institutions. It's been around for more than 30 years. So IPBES came about more recently. It's only about 13 years old, and it was modeled on IPCC, but it's supposed to do for biodiversity and ecosystems what IPCC does for climate, and that is make regular assessments of the state of knowledge and then provide that knowledge in summarized form for policymakers so that they can use it to inform whatever decisions that they need to make. But the catch for both of these, for IPCC and IPBES, is it's supposed to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So I'll return to this in my talk because it's a really fine line to try to walk. You want to make sure that you are using the science and talking about science in ways that are relevant for policymakers, but you're not telling them exactly what to do. And so all of our recommendations aren't even called recommendations in these reports. They are findings. And so that's just the sort of language that we use to try to not get into the sort of forbidden land of being overly policy prescriptive. So people sometimes criticize this, right? That it sometimes sounds a little generic, some of the findings that we have, but it's all aimed at being relevant but not prescriptive. So IPBES is a little bit, as I said, it's modeled on IPCC. It is a little bit different, though. It does have some different modalities. There are fewer country governments that have signed up to IPBES, so it's a membership organization, and that means countries sign up to it, and then countries help work on these assessments. It's really kind of what we call co-production, so governments and scientists working together. And so there are about 150 governments that have signed up to IPBES, so there's a real interest here. And the idea is that it really focuses on biodiversity, and some of the early reports, assessment reports that IPBES have done were very biodiversity specific. But in the last couple of years, governments said, tell us more about how biodiversity relates to other issues. And that was the genesis of the Nexus Assessment. And so the Nexus Assessment is supposed to basically highlight all of the interlinkages between biodiversity, but also water, food, health, and climate change, to not treat biodiversity in isolation, to really think about the ways that feedbacks and interconnections among these different elements are really important to understanding this holistic picture. So governments requested this report in 2019, and we only got it done in 2024. So you can see that these are very long processes. This doesn't happen overnight. So the sort of key message of the report is really summed up in this cartoon that a Belgian artist did. He likes to do IPBES reports and sort of do them in cartoon form. And it's this idea that we cannot treat problems in isolation, that we're facing a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis, a water scarcity crisis, a food security crisis, and health crises, whether it's malnourishment or pandemics, and that these are all related and that we cannot treat them as separate instances. And so that's really the genesis of all the work that we did on the Nexus Assessment, is to think about these deep interconnections. So we did our report. It was approved by governments at the end of last year, 2024. And I think we were fairly successful in getting that message of interconnection out into headlines. So these are some of the major headlines that came out right after the report was adopted. You can see New York Times, New Scientist, BBC, Financial Times. And the key theme that we were trying to get out is that things cannot be treated in a siloed manner. And I think you can see in the headlines that stuck. People understood that message. And so one of the things that we're doing now that the full report has basically been adopted by governments, is doing events like this, talking to different audiences about the details. So the overarching message of interconnection, I think, is out there and people are understanding, but what does it actually mean? Like, what does it mean for how we might do policies at the local level? What does it mean for a town like Ithaca, that it needs to think about the integration of these issues? So that's the phase that we're in right now. It's like really helping put this into practice. So I'll give some examples of that in a few minutes. But let me just talk about the process, because not that many people raised their hands when I was asking if you knew what IPBES was. So I'm going to assume a lot of you may not know about processes that these science policy institutions and interfaces use. So IPBES and IPCC are not the only ones. Here in the US, for example, we did until recently have a US National Climate Assessment. And this is a congressionally mandated state of climate science that is put together by hundreds of scientists through a very formal process. It gets formal peer review. The whole idea of these reports is to basically advise Congress. We had a 5th National Climate Assessment that came out in 2023. We were supposed to have a 6th National Climate Assessment that was going to come out in a couple of years, and it's been canceled by the current administration. So that's in limbo. But just to say, there are formal processes for doing these sorts of large-scale reviews. And they are reviews. They are not the generation of new knowledge, in the sense that we are not going out and doing experiments and doing surveys on the ground or anything like that. We are collecting data that's already out there that maybe hasn't been synthesized in a certain way. Maybe different communities, different literatures haven't spoken to one another. So it's novel in the sense that we're drawing on things that are already there and putting them together in novel ways, but we're not actually collecting new data ourselves. So that's a sort of a point to remember about these science policy interfaces. So our report was massive. It was the biggest author team that has ever been put together by IPBES, which is saying something because they do these regularly. So we had 165 authors. Spread across essentially 7 chapters, and one chapter, which Mario knows well because he was one of the co-leads of, had 5 subchapters. So, right, if 7 isn't complicated enough, add 5 extra. And so we had an amazing team, though. We had folks that were representing science communities in almost 60 different countries. And one of the things about these assessments is that you want a really interdisciplinary group of people that can come together and work in teams and sort of leave their own individual research silos and talk to people that maybe they haven't worked with before. And if I had to go back and think about all the people that were on our report, I would be hard-pressed to say, oh, that person's a soil scientist. Oh, that person was a meteorologist. I sort of know where people came from, but they left that at the door. And they came together and worked in interdisciplinary teams. And for the faculty members in this room, like when you've written papers with other people, you know how it is. It can get a bit complicated. We'll multiply that times, try to get 165 people to write together. It's a bit of a challenge. But I think ultimately the power of these assessments is that they do have so many people. They do have so many governments looking and helping us and review the documents that we're putting together. So this one had a particularly large team. We drew on lots of different types of evidence. One of the things that IPBES, I think, does really well is it doesn't limit itself to peer-reviewed scientific evidence, but it also draws on indigenous and local knowledge, gray literature from governments, and it tries to synthesize this in ways that really, I think, try to do as much justice as they can to the fact that different types of knowledge are out there, everything from very localized knowledge to things at the global scale. And so try to put all that together can be a challenge, but IPBES takes that seriously and has processes to try to do that. So you can see we've got an author team. I don't know if I have a little clicker here, but so we have a big author team. Here's Mario, back of your head, in our approval plenary, which was a little bit contentious. So these reports have to be adopted by governments in consensus. Yes, very contentious with certain countries because some of the things that this report talks about, you cannot talk about the intersections between food and climate without talking about trade linkages. And some countries are very sensitive to the implications of their international agricultural trade. So it was contentious for some governments. It took much longer than we thought it was going to, but ultimately it was approved. And so that, I think, is testament to the quality of the report. So these reports have different facets, and so there's an underlying massive set of documents, the 7 main chapters, and then a smaller summary for policymakers. And the summary for policymakers is negotiated line by line by line with governments, and so it takes a process of days where all these governments get together. But the underlying science is written by the scientists themselves. And so our report looked at these issues of interlinkages in a couple of different ways and with different methodologies and different teams. So we had an introductory chapter, then we had a chapter 2, which was really about current trends. So what's happened in the past, what's happening now. So this is collecting existing data on trends in freshwater availability, how it relates to biodiversity loss and so forth. Then we had a team that was working on future scenarios. So what do the models and scenarios tell us about the interlinkages going into the future? So if we overproduce food in unsustainable ways, what is that going to mean for biodiversity by 2050 and so forth? Then we had a team of mostly social scientists that were working on policy options and governance questions. So if we want to try to understand the interlinkages between all of these, biodiversity, food, water, and health in a policy realm, what are the barriers? What are the enablers that help policymakers see things holistically? So they came up with, I think, a really interesting chapter. And then we had this massive chapter 5, which was divided into individual chapters where specialists in biodiversity, specialists in water, specialists in food, health, and climate all worked in individual subchapters to think about what are all the possible solutions that we could come up with for, say, the water sector, but which touch on the other 4 sectors. So they were siloed in a sense that they were trying to be in the mindset of somebody in a sector, but how can they choose interdisciplinary solutions, what we called response options, that can give us benefits for the other sector. So that was really their task. And then Mario's task was to weave all of those together in one giant chapter. He and another coordinating lead author, Taylor Ricketts at the University of Vermont, and Pete Smith at University of Aberdeen in the UK, really did a masterful job of trying to herd these cats to get them together into this massive chapter. Then we had a chapter on economics and financing, because you can't change policy without also changing our economic systems. And then we had a chapter at the end basically talking about practicalities. How do we actually get people in a room together to make the change happen? And that was our final chapter 7. And so it was complex. It was incredibly complex. I'm going to try to distill just the main messages down for you today. And if I could basically leave you with 3 key things. It's that even though we know these crises are interconnected, the way we deal with them now is not particularly holistic or integrated. We tend to treat the climate crisis as a separate thing from the biodiversity crisis, from the water crisis, and so forth. So those of you in global development know, if we want to talk about human well-being, it touches on all of those things, and you have to try to approach things holistically. But realistically, we still have ministries of water and ministries of agriculture, and they just often don't talk to one another. So that's part of the problem. Our second key message was that solutions already exist. Like, we do not need to wait for some magic technology that is going to save us. We don't have to hope for some sort of integrated solution. Those solutions exist now. They're out there. They're available. They may not be applicable in every single place, but there's a wide menu of them that people at different levels can pick and choose from. And so our job was to really lay out that menu, and we came up with 71 different response options, different things that people can do to approach these problems in a more integrated manner. And then finally, the third message was, because these are so systemic, deep problems, there's really a role for everybody. Like, everybody needs to be on board. There is a role for everyone, from local communities and town planning to individuals working together within their communities to global institutions. And so part of the report is laying out, what can these different actors in different places do? So let me talk about the first one, the sort of interconnected nature of the crises and our lack of interconnection in terms of how we respond to them. So one of the things that the report, I think, does really well is really assess the state of our knowledge on these interconnections. So how is, for example, unsustainable agriculture a driver of biodiversity loss or a driver of climate change? And so the schematic that you see up here is a way to try to make sense of that and to show those interconnections. So we have, for example, unsustainable agriculture is a major driver of biodiversity loss because of land use change. You can see that in the white box at the top. Well, as a consequence of that, we have all of these impacts that stream into different sectors. So the blue, for example, are impacts on the water sector. So we have increased pollution, particularly in soils and rivers, when we overuse pesticides and fertilizers. We have reduced water availability if we are overusing and diverting water for irrigation. We have reduced water quality as a consequence of all the pollution. So you can see all these interconnections, right? Land use change, when we're converting particularly from forest to agriculture, we have increased greenhouse gas emissions. That intensifies climate change. That in turn can feed back into reduced food quantity and quality, particularly around micronutrients and the inability to kind of keep up with closing crop yields over time. So all of these things are interconnected. So you cannot just pick out one of these boxes and say, I'm going to work on reduced water availability. I'm a water specialist. I'm just going to work on how we can get more water, without thinking about climate change and food and water and health. And so that was a key message that I think policymakers took to heart, that they're not doing a particularly good job of that right now. And part of the problem is that researchers, we ourselves, often tend to be in somewhat siloed communities. So we publish in certain journals, we work with certain methodologies, we don't always work in interdisciplinary teams. So we have a job ourselves to kind of understand these interconnections and try to, expand our own networks of research and how we do things. So then we tried to make the point that the existing way that we pull out individual problems and treat them as we can deal with them in isolation, we need to shift our own mindset to this idea of a nexus approach, to think about the holistic and systemic way that we can treat problems. And so rather than that slide I just showed about, one problem of land use change due to unsustainable agriculture feeding into all these problems, what if we reverse that and we thought about things that we can do in an integrative manner that have positive feedbacks, sort of, change this scenario. And so this is an example where if we treated our ecosystems as places that actually provide a ton of benefits for us through ecosystem services. So if we, for example, had wetland and mangrove restoration, which you can see in the lower corner, that provides natural filtration, that provides better water quality, that provides better opportunities for healthy fisheries that people can then benefit from in terms of fish protein. If we had more resilient agricultural systems that relied on agroecology, we would have increased increased food system resilience to ongoing climate change. We would have reduced pollution. In turn, we would have better quality water. And getting that mindset that if we treated these things in a much more holistic way, we can see how the puzzle fits together. And so each one of these kind of grayish boxes is one of the solutions, one of the response options that is proposed throughout the report. And each of those response options has a whole set of evidence behind it that we hope is convincing enough for governments that they're going to want to do these things. And one of the messages is, yes, there's a whole menu of these response options, but you have to do them together. Like there's no silver bullet. Like one of these things is not going to do it for you. You have to pick and choose how they fit together. So this is a great example. Kind of think of it as like a planning puzzle. Have some wetland restoration, have changes in agriculture, have changes that sort of integrate landscape and seascape approaches, have some forest-based climate solutions, and they all work synergistically together. Some of them, can enable other actions to happen if you take them. So one of the things that we did from an evidence standpoint, because policymakers don't have time to do all of this, right? They want like the one-page summary of what these interconnections are. So something like this graph that we put together in our report has literally hundreds of pages of evidence behind it. And so this is a systematic review of the scientific literature where there has been reports on the current state of 3 or more nexus elements working together in somebody's report. So they looked at water plus climate plus biodiversity, for example. And what are the synergistic relationships among those elements? So if you, for example, reduce biodiversity, so you lose biodiversity, negative symbol, there's an impact on food. So we tend to think, particularly if you're in the agricultural sector, like, well, I'm going to convert forest because I need more land. Well, there are consequences to do that. You often end up with reduced water availability, reduced pollinators, reduced soil quality, and so forth. So showing those interconnections based on the review of hundreds of studies in a very simplified format for policymakers is something that these assessments try to do. And so it really tries to boil down everything that, our collective scientific knowledge into more digestible form. So this is an example of the sort of thing that we put in our report. We also, in the report, talk about futures. And so this is based on scenario studies and modeling. So what we know about those sort of current interactions, if we can forecast those, project those into the future, we know that we're going to see some changes happening if we don't tackle our unsustainable, particularly our unsustainable food production, but our unsustainable societies in general. So what the report did was, again, look at a lot of different scenario and modeling studies. So this particular graph is based on almost 200 different scenarios and models. And the team that worked on this basically divided that large number of models into 6 what they called archetypes. So 6 types of models that had fairly, could be clustered. They had fairly similar outcomes. And so they gave each one of these names. And what they essentially said is, all of these agree that our current business as usual, keep doing what we're doing, is unsustainable now, and it will be much more so in the future. We will have even more scarcity, even more problems with food insecurity and biodiversity loss in a lot of these models. And so the sort of business as usual are these 2 bottom archetypes. So models that show, for example, a focus just on food production without thinking about sustainability, and then our sort of current pathway where we're not spending very much time and money on nature in particular. So those 2 are really the business as usual. But there are scenarios that show that you can get away from that. And that's really one of the things that I think is one of the positive messages of this report. And those are the first 2 archetypes, which is, so archetypes that are around nature conservation. So these are things like conserving 30% of the world's oceans and lands for biodiversity. You can actually do that in an integrated way that doesn't increase pressure on food production and other lands in a way that's sustainable. That's what some of the models are telling us. You can also have changes where you're not focused quite as much on biodiversity, but you're still trying to get a much more balanced division across these elements. And there's a bit of a cost to that. So you can see that in the arrows here. So when you have a much more conservation-oriented focus, you get much more biodiversity, but you don't get as much food, right? Whereas if you have a more balanced approach where maybe there's a little bit of an acceptance of a trade-off of biodiversity, you could see in the middle, you get slightly more positive benefits for food. So it's really about acknowledging that there's trade-offs, right? There's no magic win-win that we can all accept. And like, if we just did this magic thing, we're all going to be great. It's about acknowledging trade-offs and managing for them, accepting like there might be a decrease in biodiversity in some areas, there might be an increase in food. Is that a trade-off we're willing to accept? And so getting policymakers in different places to understand and accept those trade-offs is a big part of the message of the report. So let me talk about those response options, like the tangible things that can be potentially done to tackle these interlinked crises. So the idea is that a response option is just kind of a broad term for actions or policies or management on the ground, anything that we can do that is going to try to get us these integrated synergistic benefits. And so the report lays out a number of possible options. They can be taken by all sorts of different actors in different places. They can be implemented at different scales, from very localized scales to much more global scales. They have different levels of feasibility, whether it's economic feasibility or social feasibility. Not every option is going to work in every place. They're context dependent, which is why we presented a whole bunch of them, that you can sort of pick and choose what fits your context. And they're all available now. Like, these are not things that we're waiting for some sort of technology. You can decide to do it tomorrow if you wanted to. So we divided these 70 plus options into 10 sort of broad categories. And I know you're not going to be able to read the text on these, but you can download the report and get the details. So category 1, conserve our ecosystems. Stop cutting down ecosystems and degrading them when they're serving us wonderful functional purposes to mitigate climate change, increase water quality, and so forth. Restore ecosystems that have been degraded. So replant mangroves, make sure that our wetlands are restored. Manage ecosystems, particularly our agro-ecosystems, in ways that are holistic and integrative. So things like agroecology and focus on soil health and so forth. Consume sustainably. So these are around things like sustainable diets, making sure that we are producing food in ways that are sustainable, but that people themselves are also demanding them. So moving away from meat-heavy diets to much more sustainable diets. Reducing pollution, thinking about all of the ways that pollution is a consequence of the way we manage water and food in particular, but also the way we tackle climate change, because oftentimes the greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change are also associated with health impacts from things like particulate matter. So millions of people die per year from fossil fuels as a direct result of air pollution. And so when you tackle climate change, you're also incidentally often tackling those air pollution deaths. Think about integrating planning and governance. So approach watershed planning in an integrated manner. Don't try to treat it as something that you only do in one place, but connect it to seascapes. Think about ways in which ministries and different departments can work together. Manage for risk in ways that are integrated. If you think about disaster risk, that's a consequence of climate change. We can potentially treat that with things like nature-based solutions, using nature to try to mitigate against storm surge rather than, building new seawalls someplace. Ensuring rights and equity. This is a really important set of options that really focus on things like gender equity, recognition of Indigenous peoples' land rights, because a lot of these can help us because those communities are already managing their ecosystems in integrated ways, but they just need to be scaled up or supported. Financing is a huge part of this. Find new ways to channel positive financing to these sort of incentive mechanisms that need it. And then finally, we had a category of others, things like education, that didn't really fit in the other categories. So one of the things that these teams did was actually score each of these options. So they looked at the evidence and I know you can't read that, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. They would go across and they would say, okay, actions to restore soil health. What sort of benefits do they have for biodiversity, health, food, and water? And so this is, again, based on hundreds of studies that the folks that were working on these reports looked at. And so it gets us a huge number of benefits for a lot of sectors. But that's not to say all sectors. You can see there's a few places where there's red dots. That's an indication of a trade-off. And the idea is if you show the trade-offs, people can make these in a much more cognizant manner than if you just ignore them right now, which is the way we kind of do it right now. We also tried to show that these options are widely applicable across the globe. So you can apply them. You can see there's basically an example from every region of the globe except for Antarctica on ways that are actually happening on the ground. People are using these response options. So they really are applicable in many, many different places. So this is just one example. So urban green infrastructure was one of the solutions, the response options proposed. And it's often done in a way that kind of refers to either water management or biodiversity management. But the health team pointed out there's massive health benefits from urban green space because you can walk, you get air pollution benefits, you get mental health benefits. I think a lot of us recognize that during COVID when we were in lockdowns, right? Being out in nature is really a part of a healthy society. And so the health team really pointed out, these are things that give us a lot of health benefits. And so the researchers looked at specific examples. For example, there's a case study of Singapore, where there's a very concerted effort to do a lot of this integrated green space planning and a lot of clear benefits to the population as a result. So I wanted to give a couple of examples. This was not a US-focused report, but I wanted to give you a couple of examples just drawn from my own experience. So these all match those response option categories I was just talking about. But the nice thing is, like, we're already doing a lot of this integrated work in the US. Sometimes it's not funded adequately. Sometimes, it's running into all sorts of institutional barriers, but it is out there. So things like, open space conservation programs. New York State has one, New Jersey has one. This gets us multiple benefits across those elements if it's done in an integrated way. Similarly, with managing ecosystems, we have conservation reserve programs to encourage farmers to have prairie strips or to conserve pollinators on their land. We have programs in schools to help students understand about consuming sustainability, things like food gardens in schools. I think that fits this bill. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So I think that's the encouraging news. It's like we don't have to wait for somebody to come rescue us. We already have the tools. We just need to think about how to sort of deploy them more effectively. And that's part of this last, I said there's kind of a third key message, and that's everybody has a role to play. So everybody in this room, you have a role to play. You just have to find your niche, something you could be working on, and you can be part of these solution spaces. And so as part of the report, we talked about different steps that are needed to kind of get us to this more idealized, holistic approach. And so as part of the report, we really talked a lot about process, like how do you get people in a room to actually talk to one another, and what do they need to make these integrated decisions? So we came up with this idea of kind of a roadmap, like what if I was a policymaker, what would my roadmap look like? Where would I want to go with it? And so the report talks about these different steps that policymakers can take. And so the roadmap talks about, like, the first sort of set of things you can do is just understand what integration means in policymaking. Like if I did A, if I push this button, consequence C over here is going to happen. Just helping policymakers understand that is crucial. And I'm so glad to see such a big room, because all of you guys are going to be out doing that once you leave here, I hope, helping people understand all of that. And then the second set of stuff is kind of convening people together to coordinate their strategic action. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned in different places on how you do that. Everything from like participatory scenarios to co-production with communities. There's a whole set of things that we can do process-wise. And then finally, when we go to the point that we're actually implementing these on the ground, how do we scale them up to different places? How do we make sure they're adaptive? How do we make sure that we're flexible? If something's not working, that you got to kind of tinker with it on the spot, we need to do all those sorts of things. So we talk a lot in the report about how decision makers can do all of those steps. And I would just say, to kind of wrap it up here, we're going in the wrong way in the US right now. So if you want to have more integrated Nexus approaches, here are the things you would not do. You would not change the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gases, which is something that's been proposed here in the US. And a bunch of scientists actually wrote a report. I got a lot of news last week, the day after Labor Day, rebutting this idea that the current administration has put forth that greenhouse gases are not harmful to human health. Well, about 85 of us who were just kind of on social media and said, well, who's going to respond to this report? And somebody else was like, I think it's us. Like, I think we're the people that are going to respond to this report. So we did. It made the New York Times. I don't know if it's going to sort of change the policymakers' mindset, but, better to throw yourself in front of the speeding train and slow it down a little bit. But changes in financing. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture has rescinded a lot of their local food support, which is, I know people in this room know this very well, which is absolutely devastating to small farmers that had contracts with local school districts and so forth. So very punitive for a lot of our small farmers, particularly in New Jersey. Dismantling a climate change and health initiative that was at the National Institutes for Health, right? That was a sort of integrative approach. That's gone now. U.S. Department of Energy and Agriculture used to coordinate on an agrovoltaics program. They're trying to rescind that. Again, food and energy and climate all integrated. It was a great program that's being cut. Cutting a lot of our forecasting ability that's being done by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And finally, eliminating some of our climate adaptation science centers. Like, how do we generate science in different places to help inform local adaptation? Those are all under threat. So Europe is doing a lot on Nexus approaches. We're kind of going backwards here, which is a shame because I would argue that all of these things are not controversial in the sense that they provide wide benefits for lots of people who are constituencies of this current government, right? Farmers and folks in rural areas and folks who are worried about electricity prices. So I think Nexus approaches actually are a great, should be a great sort of bipartisan approach, and they haven't been, which is, I think, a real shame here in the US. So I'll leave you with this, and that's this idea that I hope you sort of appreciate the urgency of tackling all of these issues in a more holistic manner, and that we have the evidence and tools now. We can always learn more about some of these interlinkages. There's certainly a role for research, but we have enough evidence to act now. And we should be doing so, and everybody has a role to play, right? So if you're really interested in this, one of the things I do personally is I've torn up my yard, right? Like, we don't really need yards. We can have gardens and pollinator, friendly plants and so forth. And I live in New Jersey, and so we kind of have tight spaces as it is. And I was like, oh, what are my neighbors going to say about me, like tearing up this yard and putting in a bunch of plants that look like weeds? And literally everybody that walks by with their dog says, how did you do that? I want to do it. What are the benefits of it? It's beautiful. So little things like that can make a difference. They're spreading in our little neighborhoods, these pollinator-friendly yards. I hope we can do more, but that's the sort of thing that we need more of. And I hope I've encouraged you to think about how you can do that in the various settings that you're in. So I think I'll leave it for Q&A at this point and open it up.
This is about this.
Yeah, that one, I think. And the QR code is for the report, so you can download it there.
We have about 12 minutes for Q&A and discussion. If you raise your hand, introduce yourself and make your question.
Hello, my name is Irene. I'm a second-year MPA student, Master's in Public Administration. Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. I didn't know about the Nexus Assessment before, and now I definitely do. My question was more so around kind of the chapters, the overview you were giving us, how it goes along past trends, future trends, and how to kind of engage with these sectors. I was curious, is there a portion in the assessment that talks about certain possible impediments to these approaches? What are certain limitations, and how to approach that?
Yeah. Go ahead and answer individually. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and part of the reason why we had so many social scientists on this report is that this is not a technical or scientific problem, right? This is often around behavior and values and institutions. And so we had this whole chapter 4, where policy specialists and psychologists and people who have these different backgrounds got together and said, what are those type of barriers? What is preventing us? If these are so great, why aren't we all doing them, right? And it turns out there's a ton of different barriers. So there's sort of individual psychological barriers that, like me and my pollinator garden, like worried about what the neighbors would think, right? And so helping people to understand how to kind of overcome those, that's a part of it. Thinking about how institutions are set up. So people who sort of, you're an MPA student, right? There's a whole theory about why institutions do the way things they do. And how can you harness that for more integrated approaches? And what might be the dangers of that? Because some folks were pointing out, like, if you're sitting, in a government office and all of a sudden you get another mandate, you have to now go talk to the Minister of Water more. You've got to go talk to the Minister of Food more. That's more work for you. You don't want to do it, right? And so how do we get out of the mindset that being integrative is actually more work? How can we convince people that working together with others can maybe save you money because you're not duplicating efforts, right? It turns out a lot of times in government, like, building A is not talking to building B, and they're both doing the same thing, and they're spending twice as much money as they need to, right? And so kind of finding those places where you can tweak or you can change those mindsets was a really important part of the report. And so, yeah, I urge you to, the underlying chapters are just being finalized in sort of a pretty format in PDF form. But if you go to this QR code, you get the summary, and then soon you'll be able to get to the underlying chapters as well. And you kind of really dig into that literature. A lot of these underlying chapters have like hundreds and hundreds of references. And so they're really useful sort of tools as a bibliography as well.
Hi there. My name is Christina. I'm a third-year PhD student here in the Development Studies program. First of all, congratulations. I think this is such a needed and fantastic initiative to mainstream these ideas and actually make them legible for everyday people. So thank you for the work you all have been doing and pushing forward. My question is about cost.
Yeah.
And when I see your slides and hear you talk, I'm thinking about, low to mid-level bureaucrats with all the best intentions, but cash-strapped government budgets, and just all like public agencies in general, especially in low-income contexts. So I'm just looking for your advice on what are the most promising financial kind of mechanisms and instruments today? Is it just the Gates and the Rockefellers? Are there other ways? When you think about, stretched public budgets, where does your mind go? Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I can answer in two different ways. One is to talk about the response options themselves. So some of them are very low cost, or they actually save money, right? You don't have higher upfront costs for some of them. Others you might, right? You might save over time because you're reducing, say, your inputs, your agricultural inputs. But the upfront cost of converting might be rather high, right? You only save it over time. So that's part of the reason why we had a bunch of different response options that sort of check different boxes, right? And some might be more expensive. And so you do need to get some sort of public commitment to do some of them, but not all of them by any means, right? So there's a sort of continuum of costs of the individual response options. And then the other thing we did in the report is think about the overall financing, our economic systems, and what could potentially change within those to enable those individual response options. So a classic example is subsidies. Right? We're already spending public money on subsidies that are harmful to nature. These are fossil fuel subsidies, fishery subsidies, agricultural subsidies. And so the cost of that and rechanneling those into these more sustainable approaches, right? That's a classic example. Thinking about sort of innovative modalities. So this could be, in some cases, it might be like payments for ecosystem services if it fits in that location. It might be raising more money from philanthropies and other places, right? And so again, there's no silver bullet, but you can kind of point out different things. And so within the report, we kind of said there's like three big categories of financing things. So one is dealing with incentives. So changing subsidies, trying to get positive incentives for businesses. There's a whole group of things around information. Like right now, it's really hard to track some of the financial flows. It's really hard to understand business risks. So there's a whole swath of things you can do around information. And finally, there's a whole swath of things you can do to raise more money. And so just have different sorts of, like I said, PES and other things. So those all work in concert, right? If you have better information about what's going on that's negative, you can attack the negative subsidies and turn them into potential increased amounts of finance and funding, right? And so a lot of this is going to be tackling sort of widespread structural problems. And, it's not something we can change overnight. But I think we saw, at least during COVID, how rapidly you can mobilize if you need to for an emergency, And so recognizing that we are in a climate emergency, we are in a biodiversity emergency, and just getting policymakers to accept that as well, I think is part of this changing the structural dynamics. So.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Ethan in the Global Development Program. I was wondering if you had met with any direct opposition to the report coming out.
Yeah.
I know you talked about this government, but anywhere else and specifics, anyone directly opposing what you're saying?
Right. I mean, the adoption of the report was contentious. It did say some things that governments don't always want to hear. And I was mentioning a few countries that are particularly dependent on agricultural trade were extremely sensitive about any criticisms of the unsustainability of that agriculture. And so the report, would it have been stronger without those voices? Probably. But the whole idea of these is that they're consensus documents, right? This is a criticism you can make for all of our global negotiations. They always have to be consensus. So sometimes you end up representing the lowest common denominator in some cases. I don't think that happened in our report because there are still quite a few very progressive, very interesting, very forward-thinking things that countries are building into some of their decision-making right now. So, we're not doing it here in the U.S. If there had been a different administration that was more interested, we probably would be doing events for Congress and for the various agencies. That's not happening. But it is happening in other places. So Europe, for example, we've had several uptake events with various countries there that are asking, give us some details. We want to actually build this into our next 5-year plan. We want to build this into some of our financing decisions. What do we need to do? So that's encouraging. So I wouldn't say there's been like full opposition, but it's sort of slower uptake, a little bit less enthusiastic. As I was saying in the U.S., like a lot of the cuts that are happening at the federal level into nexus-oriented things, that's not a reaction to our report, right? That's a sort of larger political situations going on. And I wish we could reverse that with our report. But I think the good news is, even if the federal government is absent on some of these for the next few years, states and localities are super interested in them. And so I know in New Jersey, we're dealing right now with a lot of coastal resilience issues, and our report has a ton of things to say about that. And coastal communities at the municipality level are very interested in that. So we're starting actually some new projects on this idea of nexus governance. How do you get people to act in an integrated manner at the township level in New Jersey, which is hard, but interesting. And so we've got some research, or I've got some research projects that are going to be starting this year about that. So.
Please, two more.
My name is Ruben. I'm in MPS Global Development. Thank you so much for your presentation. I am from a country where when there is like a light, people will shout of joy. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, farmers cannot have access to like rainfall or their crops because of the climate change, even though we don't have like industries. So my question is, how can global collaboration be structured to ensure that historical like inequalities in climate responsibilities and the disproportionate vulnerabilities of resources do not bias like the implementation of this approach you talk about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that the chapter that looked at sort of current status and trends did was a global mapping of current vulnerabilities to these individual crises, but then these crises overlaid on one another, right? So using GIS tools to see where there's food insecurity, where there's climate pressure, and so forth. And the existing vulnerabilities, I mean, not surprising to anybody in this room, are places like certain developing countries, small island states. So folks that have contributed the least to the problem are already experiencing the burdens, right? And so any sort of solution that we try to generate, we don't want to add to already existing vulnerabilities and pressures. And I think one of the good things, and I showed the map of all of the different response options that can be implemented in different places, is that a lot of these potential solutions are things that would not add to existing vulnerabilities and in fact would help reverse them. The ones particularly that are low cost, the ones that are focused on things like improving health in conjunction with increasing agricultural yields or tackling climate resilience and so forth. And one of the things that we noted in our report is that a lot of times when we talk to, agricultural extensionists or when we're talking to climate folks, health is left out of the equation. Right? They're not really thinking about the health implications of a climate change solution or an agricultural approach that's supposed to increase food productivity. But if you bring health into it, if you think about not just, well, we want to increase the volume of food produced, but it has to be healthy food. Right? And we have to maybe link it to schools that might buy the local healthy food, right? And we start making those interconnections, we're actually decreasing the vulnerability of the most vulnerable people as opposed to adding to their burdens. So that was definitely in people's front of mind when we were looking at these response options. And in fact, one of the measures on which they were scored was, do they help reduce vulnerability? Do they actually help improve equity? What are the social dimensions of these response options, right? We can't just look at them in technical terms. And so part of the reason why this particular suite was chosen is because they didn't increase those burdens. So.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'll be remiss if I didn't ask you to mention something about your new book.
Oh,
that
yes.
is available online.
Yes. So I was talking about this report, but I actually have just published a book. Yeah, I don't have it up here, so I'll just tell you. So if anybody's on Blue Sky, you can look me up. I'm Pam McElwee, all one word, Blue Sky. And I have it pinned. And so it's free until tomorrow. Do you want to download my, is this? That's attendance. This is attendance. Yeah, this is the attendance. This is not the QR code. Yeah. So if you want my book, free for download until tomorrow, you can get it. The other place you can get it is with Cambridge University Press. It's their Element series. So these are shorter books. They're not like 300 pages. This is 100-page. And it's called Sustainable Development and the Environment in Southeast Asia. So it's all about integrated approaches in the Southeast Asian region. If you're interested in that, free for download until tomorrow. Get it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.